Well, let's begin. There's a prayer on top of the handout if you want to pray with me. Oh Lord, if we are afraid of anything, let it be the fear of not committing ourselves fully to you. Let us fear that the day will pass without our having lightened the load of another. Let us fear that someone will come looking for you and find only us. Amen. Okay, so I think a bunch of you just came from the church service. If you're going to go to it after this, excuse me. The theme of the window this week is missionaries, which we already kind of started talking about. And the I am passage used to talk about a mission is Jesus saying, I am the vine, which we're going to unpack a bit. And of course, this is a good verse for this in terms of it reflects the fact that the theology of the church and the fact that we're supposed to spread the gospel is rooted in Jesus. We're supposed to be rooted in Him. So let's talk a little bit about these missionaries. Christine talked about this in her sermon, and I'm sure a bunch of you were there at the noontime Visio Divina when I wasn't there, but I heard about it, when a group spontaneously prayed a prayer of repentance for some of the wrongs done by these missionaries, right? So let's talk about the three of them quickly. The first one is Augustine of Canterbury. If you look on my handout where I give the description of the window, I've added in brackets to that description in the little book that we have there, dates, right? So this isn't the famous Augustine who wrote books like the Confessions. I think he died in 430. This guy died at 604, so he's a little bit later. He is famous for being sent on what's called the Gregorian missions. So Pope Gregory at the time, this was after the fall of the Roman Empire, and when the Roman Empire fell, they pretty much pulled out of England before they finally collapsed. They'd abandoned England. And here we are about 200 years afterwards, and the Pope at the time says, we need to bring the gospel to those pagans up in England, right? And so this Augustine was sent on a mission, and the picture, if you have the picture from your bulletin, he converts the English king Ethelbert. So at this time, England is just a bunch of little tiny kingdoms, and I don't actually know where Ethelbert is, right? Which kingdom was his, but he was the first one to be converted, and then through that, all the rest of England and Wales become Christian. Takes those stubborn Scottish people a bit more time. Katie, that was her. Hey, I'm like, what's my last name? I mean, you know, so, right. So that's Ethelbert, and so, right, what's happening at the time? It's worth pointing out of the Roman Empire has collapsed. There's political upheaval, there's regime change, right? So all kinds of things are happening in the world, and the church is part of this, right? And they want to go bring the gospel to the English. Of course, the cost of this is going to be their own culture, right? Especially as we already have a Christian presence to a certain degree from the Irish. Right, and one of the things that if you would go read Augustine of Canterbury, you can find translations of his things. They're trying to get the Christians who are already there to conform to Rome. So yes, it's a positive thing. They've got this commission. People coming to know Jesus is always a good thing, but it also had a pretty steep cultural cost, right? It's the same thing we can talk about William Carey. William Carey is often regarded as the father of modern commissions. So his story is he grew up in Anglican. At some point he becomes a Baptist. He's on fire for Jesus. And people began to talk about the fact of, again, what's happening for England in about the late 1700s. What's going on in the whole world?
Well,
America's getting. So we got people coming to America. He was actually quite. We got all the big thing happening is Europe and Britain in particular is colonizing the rest of the world, and he ends up going to India. Right. There's some positive things about him. He's very supportive of the American Revolution. pollution. He wants to get rid of the caste system in India. He wants to see everyone should be equal, right? He supposedly learned something like 35 different languages and translated the Bible or parts of it into all of these languages. He translated Hindu epics into English, right? So he did some good things. But of course, he also expects these Indians to basically become British, right? They need to abandon their own culture and become Christian, which means adopting European culture, right? And then we get Sheldon Jackson. He's a bit less famous, but he was a home missionary, what we used to call home commissionaries, right? Where he wanted to be a foreign missionary, but his health was poor. So a church mission board said, you should just stay here. We got work for you here. And first he went to Minnesota and evangelized to the natives there, and also in the Dakotas, and then eventually ends up in Alaska. Right? And if you heard Christine's sermon, she talked a bit about him of, again, good things, right? Built schools, was active with building hospitals, all kinds of things to help the natives there, but also expected them to stop using their own languages, supported the whole indigenous school system where we take kids from their parents and put them in a boarding school and tear their culture from them, right? So all of these guys are, their legacy is mixed. Positive things, of course, also all kinds of bad things we can look back on, right? So actually a group of you, some of you who were there, who had this spontaneous prayer of repentance, that's the attitude we ought to have. There were positive things here, but it was also a shot through with racism and ethnocentrism and economic exploitation of these native peoples, right? So I'm hoping the way I want to focus on this passage today is to maybe give us a better way to think about missions by focusing on this passage, right? So we're going to look at this passage where Jesus talks about being he's the true vine and we are the branches. And the first thing I want to tell you is that's wrong. We've actually misunderstood this, right? So I've got a quote on, I think, my handout. It's in the footnote number 2. I've quoted a scholar who says it, but he's just kind of summarizing more contemporary research, which says we got these two words wrong. It's not vine and branches, it's vineyard and vines, which I actually think is a more helpful image. It isn't one single vine, Jesus, and we're the branches off of that vine. Jesus is the whole vineyard, and we're vines in the vineyard. It actually makes more sense of the text. If you look at the text, I'm going to find he talks about pruning. Where is it? Yeah, it's verse 2. Every vine in me that bears no fruit, he removes. Who's the he there? It's God the Father. It's being depicted as the gardener or the farmer who comes and tends the vineyard, right? And even the vines that bear fruit, he prunes so they bear more fruit. I actually think this makes better sense of, if you've ever gardened, you can plant two of the same plant, and one grows really, really well, and the other one doesn't grow so well, and they're right next to each other, and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? Well, why this is happening? I think this actually helps fit the imagery better of, there's good vines that the farmer prunes, and they grow even better. And there's vines that just can't seem to make it work, and what do you eventually do? You pull them out and you throw them in a pile somewhere, right? This is the imagery that's being get here. And I think if we get it, the vineyard and vines rather than vine and branches, we make better a sense of it. It's not a huge deal, but I think it helps, right? So this theme of the vineyard and grapevines is a hugely dominant biblical theme, right? So much so that from the years 66 to 68 AD, when Israel is in rebellion from Rome, when they're making their own coins, right? What do we usually have in a coin? See, or but I mean, any kind of a coin. Who's on the front? A face, somebody's face, right? So in this time it would have been a Caesar, right? Well, the Jews aren't going to do that. Why? It's an image, right? It would be a form of, it would be breaking one of the commandments. Don't make graven images. You don't put images of people on things, right?
None of them have seen God anyway.
One of them have seen God anyway. So you can't have one of God, but you're not supposed to use images at all. But what they did put on there was this vineyard. That was what you would see on the coins for a period of time, because it is the definitive representation of Israel. Israel sees itself as a vineyard that God the Father is planting, right? So actually, if you turn my handout over to the back, I've got a bunch of Old Testament passages. And we're going to read some of these. We're going to look at some of these. This is just a smattering of these, right? We could probably find 100 more easily, right? Where we get this vineyard imagery. Jesus is intentionally drawing on all of this. When he talks, if you notice, we get a story of the vineyard. He tells parables about, people planting a vineyard. He's using it constantly. It's a big theme in the Old Testament too. And he expects his hearers, the disciples, to have all that in their head. So they know what he's doing. There's a reason why the Pharisees and other people get angry at him, because they know exactly what he's doing. Right? He's drawing on all this Old Testament imagery, right? And so we need to do that to understand what he's doing. So let's look at a couple of these, right? And get an idea of what Jesus might be doing with this imagery. So the first one is probably one of the more famous ones, Isaiah 5. Excuse me. Says, I will sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. Right, so this is a person praising God, right? And it says it's actually kind of a poem. If you read it in the original Hebrew, it's hard to get it to translate to a poem, but it goes on to say, my beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded rotten grapes. Which also sometimes this gets translated as wild grapes, right? And now inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there for me to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield rotten grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a wasteland, and it shall not be pruned or hoed. It shall be overgrown with briars and thorns, and the people of briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no grain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his cherished garden. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, a righteousness, but heard a cry. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is room for no one, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing. Surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitants. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. I'm thinking I did something wrong there with the word bath, but maybe it was a weird autocorrect. But I think we can get the point. So what is this passage about? Those of you who know maybe a little Bible history. Fall of Israel, right? In particular, what kind of a fall? What's going on? Well, they don't believe, but like this, there's all these things about the hedges are going to get torn down, and it's going to become overgrown, and
it's the temple.
The exile.
The exile. So this is going into exile in Babylon, right? The idea here is God has planted this vineyard. It's Israel. He expects it to produce good fruit. By the way, I hope this is really clear when we go back to the John passage of Jesus is talking about bearing good fruit and pruning branches. That's the imagery is right here, right?
I thought when they were talking about The watchtower, maybe they meant Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, that's where they're getting it from, right? But I mean, think of some of Jesus' parables. He's got a parable where a owner builds a vineyard, builds a watchtower, and then rents it out, right? And the people who have rented it are supposed to, give the owner a share. That's how this would work, and they don't. Remember, and this is a story where he sends a servant, and he sends a servant, and they beat him up, and they send another one, and they beat him up worse, and they send a third, and they kill him. And then what does he do? He sends his only son, and they kill him. Well, what is Jesus doing? He's taking this very parable from the Old Testament in Isaiah and adapting it to say, God built a vineyard, and who did he put in charge of taking care of that vineyard? Israel, but in particular, who? Well, he's not going to get there yet. But first, it's the Pharisees and the scribes, and the religious leaders are supposed to be tending the garden. But rather than tending the garden and giving the fruit to the owner, they're keeping it for themselves. And the owner sends person after person. Those are prophets that he sends, and they don't listen, and they beat them up, right? They kill the prophets. Remember, Jesus says, Jerusalem, oh Jerusalem, how I long to keep you under my wing. You kill the prophets, right? This is the passage behind all of that, right? And then what do? Finally, the owner sends his son, and they kill him, right? Jesus is talking about himself, right? So this imagery is really central. Jesus uses it all the time, right? But we're looking at some of where he's getting it from, right? He's not just pulling it out of the air. He's drawing on the Old Testament. Sue?
What is the meaning of the last word in this passage?
Ifa is it's like a bushel. It's a kind of a measurement, and I don't remember just how much it is, but it's small.
Okay.
I think a widow who Elijah comes to only has 3 ephahs of flour left, and it's just enough to make a few small loaves. So the idea is, right, a whole big thing of seed is going to make only a little tiny amount, right? Because, right, it's small, yeah.
What's the significance of the watchtower?
So, these are pretty big vineyards. You build a tower, and someone that sits up in the tower and watches if animals come in, or they watch if someone's going to come in and steal stuff. Right? I mean, you've got a fence, but people can still get in. So that's how they would do it, right? And if you had a farm, you had someone up in that watchtower all the time, right? And so a good vineyard has a watchtower. So the whole idea is the farmer, the gardener, has built a really fine vineyard. But it's not doing what he expected it to do, right? So that's one, right? Isaiah 27 gives us another vision of this, right? On that day, a pleasant vineyard, sing about it. I, the Lord, am its keeper. Every moment I water it. I guard it night and day so that no one can harm it. I have no wrath. If it gives me thorns and briars, though, I will march to battle against it. I will burn it up, or else it will cling to me for protection. Let it make peace with me. Let it make peace with me. In days to come, Jacob shall take root. Israel shall blossom and put forth shoots and fill the whole world with fruit. Right? Again, if you've ever gardened or farmed, it can be a battle. Right? This is the imagery here of like God is actually taking care of it, but if it turns against him, if there's briars and thorns, he's going to pull all of them up and burn it. I mean, I just want to highlight how central this agricultural imagery is in the Bible. It's all over the Old Testament, and Jesus picks it up, right? He talks about, tares amongst the wheat. He's drawing on all of this imagery constantly, right? Ezekiel, another prophet. And the word of the Lord came to me, a son of man, how does the wood of the vine surpass any wood? The vine branch that is among the trees of the forest. Is wood taken from it to make anything? Do people take a peg from it to hang any vessel on it? Behold, it is given for fire, for a fuel. When the fire has consumed both ends of it, and the middle of it is a charred, is it useful for anything? Behold, when it was whole, it was used for nothing. How much less when the fire has consumed and it is a charred, can it ever be used for anything? So, if you've ever seen a grapevine, especially an old one, right? It almost gets woody and thick, right? But the wood is useless. Can't make anything out of it. It snaps really easy, right? What are grapevines good for?
Wreaths.
What?
Wreaths.
Making wreaths, but like, what are they really good for? Grapes. Grapevines are good for grapes. They're good for bearing a fruit. If they don't bear fruit, the only thing they're good for is burning up. Or I guess you make wreaths. Well, maybe they didn't know that yet. But they're not, I do not have a vineyard. I'm not ready to tackle that. Right? Right. But this is the imagery, right? Psalm 80, you brought a vine out of Egypt. Right? I'm obviously talking about Israel. You drove out the nations and planted it. We're talking about the Exodus. You cleared the ground for it. It took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. It sent on its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river, right? The Jordan. We're talking about Israel. Why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who may pass along the way may pluck its fruit? The boar from the forest ravages it, and all the gomorrah in the field, and all that move in the field feed on it. Turn again, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see, have regard for this vine. Right? This idea here is Israel has been brought into exile because of their own sin. God has basically torn down everything to protect this vineyard, and they're again calling it God to come return, right? And then from Hosea, Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved its pillars. Their heart is false, now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars, right? So again, we could do this with about 100 other passages, right? But this imagery is central, right? And Israel is spoken of as a vineyard that God is taking care of, right? And Jesus picks up all this imagery. So let's go back to John, right? With all of that in the background, right? Jesus is talking to his disciples. So John 13 through John 17 is referred to by scholars as the farewell discourse. Jesus spends 4 long chapters talking. Pretty much, if you read those chapters, it's pretty much Jesus talking the whole time. Yes, there's some back and forth with the disciples. He isn't publicly teaching anymore in John. He's talking to the disciples. And all of this happens at the Last Supper. So we get the Last Supper in chapter 13. They do their thing. Judas leaves. They're talking. And then eventually they're going to go up to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus will pray and get arrested, right? So he's saying this all in the end. And why is it called the farewell discourse? He's saying goodbye. He's basically telling them, I'm going to go away. I'll send a helper for you, the Holy Spirit, as an advocate to be with you until I return. But I'm going to get killed, and I'm going to ascend into heaven and all of these things. And of course, this is where Peter denies him and all these kinds of things happen. But this is one of the things Jesus is teaching them at the end, right? So he says, I am the true vineyard, and my Father is the farmer. Every vine in me that bears no fruit, he removes. Right? We're back to all this Old Testament imagery. Every vine that bears fruit, he prunes so that it may bear more fruit. Right? So even if we're in the vineyard as a good vine, it's not going to be all pleasant. There's going to be some branches snipped off, right?
We need haircuts.
We need haircuts, that's right. We need some pruning, right? I did this just one time throughout this whole passage. He says, it's a you plural, so it's y'all have already been pruned by the word that I've spoken to you. I'm not going to do it all the other times, right? But then we get this theme he's going to say over and over and over again. Remain in you, or perhaps you're used to hearing it, abide in me as I remain in you, or as I abide in you, right? So remain or abide, right? His primary message here is stay in the vineyard. Don't get out of the vineyard, right? That's what Israel did, right? And what happens when you're outside of the vineyard, we get rotten grapes because they're not being taken care of. Or the other way of thinking of this, we get wild grapes. I actually think that's the better imagery, because the idea is we get the grapes the farmer has planted get cross-pollinated with grapes outside of the vineyard. Idolatry, right? In ancient Israel's context, it's you start talking to the people outside and you start worshiping Baal and stuff, right? We can also take, I'll get there right in just a second, Betty, and we can also take it, I think, for more for our time of, we get our ideas of how to follow God get corrupted. Yep.
A connection to the Garden of Eden?
Absolutely there is, right? So you're getting a little bit ahead of where I'm in my notes, but we can talk about it now. The very Garden of Eden story is a parable for Israel. Right? We've got the order backwards, right? So all of that's actually written while they're in exile, right? And what are Adam and Eve supposed to do? God puts them in the garden and supposed to tend the garden, right? I think it's in chapter 2. It's actually at the end of chapter 1. We read God created them in His own image, right? So that language makes a whole lot of sense in the ancient world. If you're the emperor, let's say Babylon, right, and your empire has all these little states in it, you send a governor to rule in your name in that state. And oftentimes they would have a painting of the emperor. I rule in the emperor's image, right? If you ever go walk into a state building with a government, like there's a picture of the Governor Whitmer on the wall, right? Because everyone who's there is working in her name, is the idea, right? That's actually what some of this imagery...
Yeah, like the one up here.
I gotta find mine. Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, that's what's... I mean, what is that? This is Augustine converting King Ethelbert, and he's got... I mean, I'm assuming that's an image of Jesus. I mean, this is kind of the idea, right? So that's one thing that's happening there, right? But if we read the Adam and Eve story carefully, what it's actually talking about is Adam and Eve are being portrayed as priests. And their job is to get trained. It's what they're supposed to be doing in the garden. They're being formed. God's, they're supposed to tend the garden, but they're being trained. Eventually, they're going to go out into the world. Because if you read Genesis, right, what happens in chapter 4?
They were driven out of the...
We're not quite there yet. That's the end of 3. What happens in chapter 4? That's earlier. That's in 3:2. So all that happens, like the fall happens. We get chapter 3. They got sin. They eat from the tree. The angel comes with his big flaming sword and kicks them out. So chapter 4, they're out. What happens in chapter 4? Cain and Abel, right? Cain kills Abel, right? And what happens to Cain? He gets sent out. And what does he find? There's all kinds of people out there. In fact, there's towns, right? So the idea that everybody came from Adam and Eve is just ruled out right there, right? Because there's all these other people living out there, right? In fact, Cain is worried they're going to kill him. So God puts a mark on him so that everybody leaves him alone, right? Anyway, the whole point is Adam and Eve were supposed to be trained as the priests who were then going to go out into the world and tell everybody about God. That was their task. Instead, they said, hey, that apple looks pretty tasty. I think this is our garden now. We're going to eat it and do what we want, right? That's all a parable for Israel. Israel was supposed to be the group of people that God calls and forms to go tell everybody else about God. They're supposed to be the commissionaries to the rest of the world. Instead, they turn inward and do their own thing, right? Which is why God sends them off into exile, right? It's this constant cycle of, I've got a plan for you. Okay, God. This looks better over here, right? I mean, and so the Adam and Eve story is actually, it's basically just telling a version of world history that casts the Israel problem back to the very beginning, right? But that's how Israel actually intended that story. And it continues, right? We're all doing this, right? Constantly, right? But yeah, so there is a huge connection to the Garden of Eden, right? They're supposed to be tending the garden, right? Which is doing what God has told them to do. And they don't, right? So it's Israel, Adam and Eve, right? And now Jesus is kind of bringing this in here, right? And of course now he's saying, I'm the vineyard. And you need to be in me, right? And again, God is going to prune you so you bear more fruit. And this is a healthy garden. And if you aren't bearing any fruit, snip into the compost pile or into the brush pile, right? We're going to come back to this probably a couple times as we have time. But I said this last week. Whenever the Bible has passages that we read like that we think are about heaven and hell, so the famous one is Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, right? The ghosts are cast out, right? Goats are cast out. The audience of those passages is always insiders. It's never a mixed audience of like believers and unbelievers. It's addressed to believers. And the idea is, if you aren't bearing fruit, you get snipped out and cast out. It isn't saying, oh, you people who don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. It's saying, you who are inside, who claim to be followers of me, but who really aren't bearing any fruit, you're getting cut out. Yep.
Okay, I'm puzzling about the people that came from.
Yep.
So God created them after God created Adam and Eve?
We're not told that, right? In fact, I think the natural reading of the text is, there's all these people around. God says, I could better help them out. How am I going to do this? I'm going to create a garden in the world that already is there. I'm going to create these two people in it. I'm going to train them to go out and teach everybody else about me, right? So, like, we don't need to buy into this idea of God creates two people and everybody else came from them. It's people evolved, they're here, they're doing things that are hurting themselves. They need God's help. God's way of helping them is to create two people who are going to go tell them what they ought to be doing. And instead, they're missionaries, exactly what they are. And they screw it up because rather than helping everybody, they just create more problems, right? So they're supposed to be the ones helping. In fact, this is the only way to make a sense of Jesus' mission, right? Adam and Eve were supposed to be doing this. Israel was supposed to be being the missionaries to the rest of the world. Jesus comes along and tells us, I am Israel. Like he basically says, I am Israel in my person. I am the one now fulfilling the plan that God had for Adam and Eve, that God had for Israel. I'm the only one who pulls it off. I think I've got it in it's the very bottom footnote on the first page. I quote Galatians 3:16. Now the promises were made to Abraham and his offspring. It does not say into offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and your offspring is, and to your offspring who is Christ. So the Apostle Paul tells us, who's going to do all this work that God has been calling Israel to? One particular Jewish person accomplishes it, right? Yep.
This strikes me, I'm thankful for the way you're working with Genesis here.
Yep.
And now Abraham and his offspring.
Yep.
Because there's a tradition in evangelical fundamentalism that when God says, I will bless those who bless you, to Abraham,
Yep.
and curse those who curse you, that he was saying, he's talking about Israel.
Yep.
And so anybody who curses Israel will be cursed.
Yep.
Anyone who blesses Israel will be blessed.
Yep.
And it carries over to where presently in
Yep.
Israel, we have, what's his name? Huckabee
Yeah.
is our
Right.
representative over there. And he understands the Bible this way.
Yep.
So that we have to bless Israel. Otherwise, we will be cursed.
Yep.
And that it brings us to the place where we are then blessing Netanyahu, who is a renegade and who has really departed from the garden, as
Right.
we were talking about.
So, I mean, right, I mean, this is definitely a prevalent reading amongst certain forms of Christianity, right? But the New Testament just destroys this reading, right? Because, I mean, especially Paul, right? I mean, Paul is the one who says, he's a Jew, he says, I wish all Israel would turn and follow Jesus. Then he goes on, in fact, God has shamed Israel by having it be the Gentiles that follow him, right? And so there is still a place of hope that Israel will turn and follow Jesus, right? But part of the point that Paul is making and that the New Testament makes is Israel, I mean, Jesus is Israel. I mean, that's where Israel is to be found, right? It's Jesus, right? And those of us who are in him. So it isn't, I want to be careful, it isn't a replacement theory, because that's the other thing Christians have done, is to say the church replaces Israel, right? It's rather that God has brought other vines into the vineyard, to use this imagery, right? And the vines that were there in the first place have become wild and rotten, right?
Well, the image there is that you were taken from a wild vine
Yep.
and
Grafted in, yep.
to the
Yep.
domestic vine.
Yep.
And if memory serves me right, the image is that you are in Abraham.
Yep.
So is the metaphor shifting a little bit?
I mean, I think that some of the metaphors are shifting, right? But I mean, again, what is Jesus? I mean, think about what Jesus is saying on those very things, right? I mean, earlier in John, he says, I've seen Abraham, right? I mean, so he's claiming that, I mean, again, he's the one who's going to be fulfilling all of these things that everyone coming from Abraham was supposed to be, right? And this is, of course, why they want to kill him and why they're so angry at him, is he's basically saying, you guys are not doing what the Father wants you to do. I am. You don't, I mean, what's happening in the chapter prior to this, we read last week, he says, you don't know my Father. You don't, I mean, it's basically this two kids saying, whose dad is stronger, come with my imagery, right? But there really are, Jesus is saying, I know the Father, I know his will. He sent me here. You don't know him at all. And they retort and say, well, you're a Samaritan and you have a demon, right? I mean, it's this back and forth, right? But that's what Jesus is claiming, right? I am the one who's going to fulfill all of these things. I know the Father. You need to be in me. You need to be following me, or you're out aside, right? Yep, Jim.
Well, I can say that as well. Like listening to you using Hebrew language to describe the Greek reality.
Well, yeah.
I mean, echo me,
Yep.
sine, righteousness, great mind, but you're reading this through the Hebrew scripture
Yep.
going into the room. That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm saying. Who's the audience? Because they are people living in a Greek environment, a changed Hellenistic environment, living in a time in which they have to make sense out of this story and what the culture. Maybe you said that before I walked in, but it's an amazing thing that this message is to whom?
Yep.
It's to Jews who are living in a Greek culture.
Yep.
Is that what you're?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's just to, I mean, so if we think about that, right? I mean, we read our New Testament, right, and it's written in Greek. Why? Because the early Christians want to bring this message to everybody, and this is the best way to do it, right? So if we were some little, I just talked to somebody yesterday from Spain whose first language is actually Basque, which if you don't know what Basque is, it's this little tiny, like, non-Indo-European language that got preserved in Spain, right?
So you remind me, I spend a lot of time looking at Greek structure.
Yeah.
And never got beyond
it, yeah. So this is what I want to explain. So, like, let's say we had this message, but we're a little Basque community, right? No one's going to understand anything we have to say if we want to tell the rest of the world about our message. In fact, right now in 2025, the best way to do it would be to translate it all into English, because that's the language that most people in the world could come to understand, right? So in Jesus' day, right after Jesus has died and ascended into heaven, they'd write all this in Greek because they want to share it, right? But that was not the language it came in, right? They're already translating it from probably Aramaic into Greek, right? And so we do sometimes have to do that reconstructive work of what did this actually mean originally, right? And how do we understand it, right? But this is definitely what's happening, that's right. I mean, the danger for scholars, which we've done for a very long time, is I know my Plato and my Aristotle, which are written in Greek, and I'm going to read that into the biblical text, which isn't what's happening, right? It's this Old Testament background, which I'm trying to get out there for us, right? But again, that's the point, right? I mean, Jesus here is really, he's drawing on this imagery that Jews would know about Israel being the vineyard of the Lord, and saying, I'm the vineyard. Right? I mean, so again, he's got this theme of, I am Israel, you need to abide in me, right? You're the vines in the vineyard, right? And it's all this language about bearing fruit, right? And of course, the other theme is love and obedience, right? He says, God the Father loves me, I love the Father. The way that this plays out is I obey the Father. And this isn't a burdensome thing, right? It's not like I'm the power, so you better obey. It's, right? God is telling us what's best for us. And we want to be on board with what God is doing, right? So it turns into this obedience, right? And of course, what's the command Jesus gives us here? He's got a command. You better follow it. Love one another, right? And of course, this means first the disciples are supposed to love one another, but it's supposed to also be expanded to love your neighbors and even love your enemies, right? I mean, this is the command, right?
He chose disciples that hated each other.
Well, exactly. He chooses people from the whole spectrum, right? We've got Matthew, a tax collector, in a certain sense, right? Colluding with the invading powers, but like very content with the status quo and benefiting from it. Till we get, Peter, who clearly doesn't want anything to do with Rome and just wants to go back to Judaism and have that the way the rule to Judas Iscariot's probably, and then we get Simon the Zealot, right? They want to go blow stuff up. I mean, it's the whole spectrum, right to left, however we want to take it, right? And he says, you guys need to be together, love one another, work together. We got a new vision now, right? And that vision is love one another, rather than having all of these factions, right? But it also clearly has a place for being critical, right? If the fruit isn't being born, snip, right? And there's definitely this push in this direction. And even if we go back to that Isaiah 5 passage, I mean, right, why is Israel, what's the problem with Israel? It isn't just that they're like, I think we tend to fall into this idea, and this goes back to some of the things Dale was talking about with Israel-Palestine, right, of we're supposed to like go worship God rather than idols and support God's people. But that isn't actually what the passage says, right? Why is Israel in trouble? What does it mean to be rotten grapes? Verse 7. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his cherished garden. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry, right? I mean, that's the idea. It isn't, worship God and glorify God. It is those things, but the question is, how do you do that? It isn't going to a church and singing songs. It's living a life characterized by justice and righteousness towards who? These other people you're supposed to be loving, right? So I'm looking at time, and we're not going to get to all the things I wanted to do, which is typically the case, but it's particularly bad today. But on the back of my handout, I wanted to highlight some quotes. So Christine used this commentary in her sermon too, but it's from a person named Leslie Canubigan, who himself was a missionary. He was a Scottish Presbyterian who ends up as commissionary in India and actually becomes a bishop of the church in India after it becomes an independent church. So he's European, but he's now serving this church in India. And one of the interesting things about him, if you're interested in him, is when he comes back to Britain when he retires, so he goes to India in the 40s, comes back in the mid-80s and says, I left the mission field and came to a new one. So he basically says Christianity here now has collapsed. And we need to apply all of the things we think about commissions in the foreign commission field back home. Right? This is how we should. Well, it's in there, right? But I want to just highlight some of the things. So this is a commentary he writes on John that he actually gives as a series of lectures to Indian Christians. And a couple of these quotes I think highlight this passage well. So the first one is, it's in the context of if we read the chapter before, Judas, not the Iscariot, there's another disciple named Judas, basically asks, Jesus, why are you telling just us this? Why aren't you telling everybody this, right? And so basically his question is, was the promise not made that all the nations would come to acknowledge that the Lord does indeed dwell and reign in the midst of Israel? Yes, indeed. And Israel had constantly forgotten this. She'd forgotten that the vine which the Lord had planted and tended did not exist for itself, but in order to give fruit to the gardener, God. Right? The gracious indwelling of God with his people is not an invitation to settle down and forget the rest of the world. It is a summons to commission. For the Lord who dwells with his people is the one who goes before them in the pillar of fire and cloud. So the promise of his presence is clinched in the words, up, let us go hence. There is a mission to be fulfilled. There is a conflict to be waged with the powers of this world. There is tribulation to be endured, for Jesus, who chose and called them, did not do so for themselves alone, but that they would go and bear fruit. So this is something I've been kind of saying as we've been looking at John, right? But we've been, how to put this, the way the gospel has been corrupted is we've turned it into this idea of we are saved to go to heaven. And actually what we're saved to do is to go tell other people about Jesus. Heaven's just a benefit because God says, I love you, I don't want you to die, right? Yeah, go.
Just 3 words here sum it all up.
Yeah.
Summon to mission.
Yeah, summon to mission, right? The point is you are called to serve, and that's what bearing fruit means, right? When we say, this is all about me, and now I'm taken care of, and screw everybody else, that's when we're bearing rotten fruit, right? We're supposed to be loving our neighbors, and we turn it into this, we got God here in our spot. Who cares what's happened to anyone else, right?
Fruit isn't used. If you
Yeah.
pick it and you store it in your garage,
Right.
it rots.
Right. I mean, this imagery is perfect. I mean, it's unending. You can kind of keep spinning it in different directions and making sense of it, right? So quote 2, he says, as the discourse proceeds, we learn what the fruit is. It is beloved obedience. The production of fruit is not directly the responsibility of the branches. The gardener charges himself with the responsibility. There are branches which belong to the vine, but which bear no fruit. The life of the vine is not in them, and they must be cut off. There are branches which bear fruit, but these must be pruned in order to be more fruitful still, right? So even there, I think there is a place to say there are, like, talk about people being cut off, but I think the better way to understand some of these things isn't individuals being snipped out of the vineyard. It's things in the life of the church and even in our own lives that God says, that idea you have, this practice a church is doing, these aren't bearing fruit. Snip. Right? So we need to get out of this idea of God's going to cast people into the fire, right? There maybe is a place for that, but it's not the primary imagery. Yep.
But I think we misunderstand the pruning.
Yep.
Because what you do is you prune back a branch that already has borne
Yep.
fruit so that you get a new one.
Yep.
So it's more about a continuing evolution.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
Reform
Yep.
idea.
No, and I think that's right too. Right. I mean, so but think of the imagery now with all of this. Jesus is saying, "Abide in me, be in the vineyard." Right. Of our job is to follow Him, not to go out of the vineyard and do our own thing, or to think that we're in control. Right. And there really is this. Our task is to abide, and by doing that, we're pruned and given direction, right? I mean, think again of a grapevine. You train the vines, right? This vine's going over here. I don't want it there. I'm going to go move it and put it back up the trellis, right? I mean, so God is the one who's behind all of this, right? We get into trouble when we go off on our own, right? When we get out of the vineyard, right? And the last one, this is kind of sums up what I've been saying. Church growth, if it does not mean bearing fruit and growing, is merely providing fuel for the fires of hell, right? For like all the terrible words of warning which are to be found in the Gospels, these words are addressed not to the unbeliever, but to the believer, not to the weeds growing around the vine, but to the branches of the vine, to those who are part of the visible body of believers. So again, all of this pruning and even trimming, right, isn't about people being cast out into hell. It's not unbelievers and believers. It's God saying, you believers need to be pruned or trimmed, right? And we too easily turn all of this into, we're the insiders, we've got the truth, we better give it to those people over there or they're going to be cast out into the fire. When actually it's saying, no, we're the ones who have rotten branches and dead branches that need to be pruned, right? And we need to trust that the gardener is going to do this well, right? Because we don't get to prune ourselves. It's kind of the imagery, right? We could spend lots more time on this, but I'm looking at time and we should probably go.
I'm sure some of the Christian nationalists have a different opinion.
Oh yes, of course.